Thank you for joining today's webinar with Israel Policy Forum. If this is the first time you are joining an Israel Policy Forum video conference, my name is David Halperin. I am the Executive Director of Israel Policy Forum. We're an organization that works to shape the policy and communal discourse, working to advance the goal of a viable outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on two states, providing Israel with security and providing it with a future that is secure, Jewish, and democratic. We work particularly closely with the policy community in Washington, with leaders, both lay and professional Jewish communal leaders throughout the country, and with leaders of the next generation. And at this moment, our work is particularly important in providing analysis to understand how we got to this situation and to provide policy resources, credible, in-depth policy resources to help navigate where we go from here. I hope all of you who are joining are already receiving our analysis, including our weekly column by our policy director and guest today, Michael Koplow, who provides a really thoughtful, insightful commentary each week that's emailed on Thursday mornings. I hope you are all receiving that. And I hope you're also turning to us for the in-depth policy resources that we are creating. Just last week, we launched a new study in search of a viable option, examining 7 potential outcomes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including the two-state solution and the Trump plan, examining where they have advantages as well as disadvantages, to have a clear-eyed understanding of the obstacles facing a two-state solution today and a clear-eyed understanding of what it means should the window close and we begin to look to what might come next. I think that sort of forthright discourse is what we are best known for, and what I hope you are tuning in for today for what will be a really important and, of course, timely conversation on yet another Israeli election. We'll be talking about Monday's election, although I'm sure a bit about yesterday's election will come through as well. To introduce our guests as well as to moderate our conversation, I'm going to turn this now over to Eli Koaz, our communications director, who's signing on from Tel Aviv, who will lead our conversation today. This video call is being recorded. You will find it on our website at the conclusion of our call. And I want to thank you all again for joining us today. Eli, off to you.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you to everybody for joining. I'm happy to be joined on panel with Tal Schneider, who's the diplomatic and political correspondent of Globus Business newspaper. She's also spent some of her recent time in Iowa and New Hampshire covering the U.S. Democratic primary for the Israeli audience, and joined as well by Dr. Michael Koplow, our policy director based in Washington, D.C. Thank you guys both for joining us. So most people, before we start, I'll also say that if anybody has a question, please use the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a computer, if you're on your phone, you'll also see that Q&A box in the bottom. And if you've called in and you want to send in a question, you can email that to info@israelpolicyforum.org. And so let's get right into it. Most people in Israel now are talking about the coronavirus, but elections happened on Monday, and it was quite a whirlwind. We had the exit polls at 10 p.m., which indicated that Netanyahu had almost done the unthinkable. We had all 3 main TV networks at 60 seats for Netanyahu and his right-wing bloc, meaning that he would just be a seat away from having a pretty easy path to what looked like immunity from criminal proceedings and an easy path to form a government. But overnight, we kind of saw the paradigm shift a bit, and we pretty much have all the votes counted, including the double ballots and the special ballot boxes for the corona quarantined Israelis. And it looks like Netanyahu's bloc will only have 58 seats, and the Gantz's bloc, which includes obviously Labor Meretz Gesher and the Joint List, will have 55 seats, and Avigdor Lieberman remains the kingmaker in the middle with 7 seats. So Tal, what do you make of what happened on Monday?
Right. So first, let me thank you for inviting me and having me briefing you. It's important, and I'm happy to be here. Obviously, it's been a very, interesting and, as you said, whirlwind week. Netanyahu, when it was on the TV with the 60 seats, it was just exit polls. So it's always good to remember exit polls are just polls. They're being conducted by asking some people. They're not the real thing. Whereas the results are coming in within the next 12 hours. And by now we almost have the full results, show a different outcome. If you look through those 3 systems of election cycles, Netanyahu bloc, the right-wing bloc, had 60 seats back in April. Then they had 55 seats in September, and now they have 58. None of those results, either 60, 55, or 58, is enough to form a government in Israel, because under the Israeli, Knesset, the way the Knesset is conducted, you need 61 actually to form a government. We have 120 seats. You need a half plus 1, that's 61. So even with Netanyahu celebrating the so-called 60 on that Monday night, we have to remember that he failed to form a government back in April with that number. Now, 55 was really difficult for him. And with the 58, he now claims he can bring on board some people from the other side. He can lure or convince people to join him and leave their parties in order to form a right-wing government. We haven't seen it yet. He was trying to do it back in April unsuccessfully. He wasn't able to do it through the year. And I think that we don't know if maybe behind the scene he has something in the works, but right now it's even more difficult, because when you need to add three more people, none of them will want to be the first one to join, because they will be afraid from other maneuverings. So it doesn't have a government. On the other side, who has 62 seats, doesn't have a government as well. As we all know, Lieberman will not sit with the Joint Arab List. The Joint Arab List says they will not sit with Gantz. And so, open your calendars and mark September for the 4th elections.
Oh no, don't want to hear that. Michael, what are your main takeaways?
So I first of all, thanks Eli, and always great to be alongside Tal. I agree with everything Tal said. It's always interesting to see how much perception shapes the way these results are interpreted. So obviously on Monday night, when the 3 networks all came out with their exit polls and they all said that Netanyahu had 60 seats in his block, there was rejoicing over at Likud headquarters. Kahol Lavan headquarters looked like a morgue. And I think everybody sort of was assuming right away that if he's at 60, he'll be able to flip one person easily. And here we are, we're going to be looking finally at a clean Netanyahu government. And then, of course, the exit polls were off by a bit, as they generally are. And he's sitting here at 58. And even with 58, Netanyahu is talking about the fact that this is an unparalleled victory for Likud, an unparalleled victory for the right. A lot of the more right-wing columnists in Israel, particularly if you read Yisrael Hayom, are echoing that same message. And within Kahol Lavan, there seems to be this sense of despair. But if you look at the actual votes, because we now have 3 elections, and so it's pretty easy to compare. 3 elections in the span of less than a year. In the first election back in April, Netanyahu and Likud ended up with 35 seats, and that was off of 1.14 million votes. And that ended up being a 60-seat block. Everybody assumed that Netanyahu would be able to form a government, and he wasn't able to because of Lieberman not agreeing to join. But this was seen as a big Likud victory. The next time around, Likud ended up with 32 seats, and that was from 1.11 million votes. So, you know, they were only off by 30,000 votes between election number one and election number two, and that was portrayed as this enormous Likud collapse. It's obviously more complicated than that because they had merged with Kulanu, they'd gotten Zehut to drop out. So, you know, it probably actually, when you add those all up, it actually was about 300,000 votes less. But in terms of the actual people who voted for Likud, it wasn't that much less. And then in this election, Likud right now has 36 seats off of 1.34 million votes, and so they're up 20,000. And you know, there's this idea that 20,000 votes, you know, it's enormous, unprecedented victory. In contrast, Kahol Lavan, which is a brand new party that did not exist before the April election, everybody's talking about this Kahol Lavan failure or collapse. They got 1.21 million votes on Monday. That's the most they've gotten across all three elections. They've gone from 1.13 million to 1.15 million to 1.21 million. So they got more votes this time, and yet the perception is that that they've collapsed. So I think that a lot of this really depends on how you want to spin it. You can interpret these results in a lot of different ways. The other thing that I will say is that there's no question that the Jewish left-wing parties really are in free fall. They went from, I think, 10 seats in the first election to 6 seats in the second election, and then Labor and Meretz actually merged. I'm sorry, that's for Labor alone. 10 seats in the first election, I think 11 seats in the second election, and then Labor and Meretz merged for this one, and that combined merger went from 11 seats to 6 seats. So it's pretty clear that voters on the left in Israel either don't view Labor Gesher Meretz as an actual alternative, and so they're voting for other parties, and the joint list went up from 13 to 16. I'm sorry, 13 to 15. So that's one possibility. It's possible that their voters are staying home. It's possible that some of their voters are migrating even still to Kahol Lavan. As I said, Kahol Lavan did actually get more votes. But it's really, it shouldn't be surprising to anybody who observes Israeli politics, but it's really kind of a brutally stark reminder that the Jewish left inside of Israel has either collapsed or really doesn't find itself with any home that it's comfortable voting for.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Michael. And I wanted to touch on that, so we'll stay there for a moment before we get into where we actually go from here and what Netanyahu and Benny Gantz can do in their respective positions. So we had something crazy happen here with the Arab voter turnout was the highest it's ever been, but by all accounts. And we have this big, what looks like is a transition in the Israeli left, where more and more the Arabs are taking a bigger part in the electoral process. And at the same time, as Michael mentioned, we have a situation where the party that founded Israel is only sending 3 members to the 23rd Knesset, which is something almost unthinkable. And we had what was talked about as this merger. I mean, some could say that the merger was a good idea because otherwise the parties would all fall below the threshold. Others will say that the merger made it easier for left-wing Israelis to move over to Kahol Lavan because they knew they would pass the threshold. What do we make of the state of the Israeli left? And is there going to be maybe a new Arab Jewish party that will like emerge out of this? I mean, we even saw higher Israeli Jews vote for the joint list, which is something that we haven't seen that much of. A lot of really interesting trends happening here, and Ayman Odeh being really like the surprise of this election and what kept Netanyahu further away from his 61. Tal, what are your thoughts?
So my thought is when you talk about the collapse of the Jewish left, I think most of those people just went into blue and white. You see that for those 3 cycles. They did not stop being lefty people. The only reason they went into blue and white is because they did not, probably they don't support a right-wing agenda or some of the things that Gantz have said. They supported him because they thought this is the only way to change, to topple Netanyahu. If you ask people around, if you look at polls, number one on that agenda of those people was to take Netanyahu out of government, which is, you know, we call it the Rak Lo Bibi, right? Just not Netanyahu. If Gantz would step into government, into UT government with Netanyahu, if he would have done that on the first time, he did not do it on the second time, but if he will do it on the third time, you will see all of those people switch right back to the left because they don't, you know, I think that was their issue. And Gantz knows that one of the reasons he doesn't step into government, he knows he will lose, you know, all of his credibility and his base. So I think the collapse of the labor, you know, now it's together with Meretz, says a lot about the sentiment the Israeli left has these days against Netanyahu. It doesn't say a lot about what they think with respect to the two-state solution or the Palestinian issue. You may find those issues back on track within a couple of years once we will know what's going on, you know, with the country. So as per voting of the Jewish crowds to the Joint Arab List, it's still very little. The Joint Arab List actually made an amazing, how would you say that, voter turnout. I spent on Monday in Tira. It's an Arab village. It started from April to September. We already seen, you know, big numbers. They came up from 49 to 59 of a voter turnout. This time around, again, it's almost around the 70, which is the same as the Jewish voter turnout. It's quite amazing. I think we had this kind of a voter turnout maybe once in Israel's history back in late 80s. But what is changed this time is about probably 90% of the Arab voters are voting for the Joint Arab List. So this kind of, you know, the Israel society is aligned in those, you know, groups that are formed in such a clear way. This is something that maybe we haven't seen, because Arab voters used to vote also for the Likud a bit, for centrist parties, for the Labor, and right now it's really they're confined to one party of their choice, and specifically with their leader Ayman Odeh and Ahmed Tibi, they're going to have an unprecedented political power. So we haven't seen anything like that. And Ayman Odeh actually said today that if Gantz is stepping into a whole Jewish government, then the leader of the opposition will be a Muslim, and that will be a first in Israel. It has, you know, great, significant consequences if he is the opposition leader. But even without being the opposition leader, the significance of this is very, very, it's important, and it's groundbreaking, really.
Definitely. Michael, do you have anything to add before we move into where the two major parties go from here?
Just to echo this analysis on the joint list, it really is. It's kind of amazing to see Israeli Arab voter turnout so high. You know, now replicating Jewish turnout inside of Israel, and it's certainly, I think it's a good sign for the integration of Arabs into Israeli politics and society going forward. The Prime Minister gave a speech today where he outright described the blocs with leaving out the joint list as if their votes don't count. And I think that the days where that is still possible are soon going to be over. I think that when you have over 70% of Israeli Arabs voting, and you have the joint list beating every single party aside from the two major tentpole parties, I think that it points to a future where you're going to have Israeli Arab parties that play a real role in the Knesset, whether it's as leader of the opposition or potentially down the road as part of a coalition. I think that's something that everybody should celebrate.
May I add something about that? about the Arab votes. Someone has told me that the Arabs, their political behavior, remind him of the way the Israeli Mizrahi, Sfaradi back in the 70s felt when they were deprived from economic rights. They were living in, the cities in the southern part of Israel or the northern part, away from government, away from elite. He said what happened with the Arabs this time around kind of a bit reminds him of the Mizrahi behavior, political behavior, when they all went as a huge group to support the Likud against the Israeli Ashkenazi elite, right? So the Arab this time around, they're treating the Likud as the elite power of the country, when they feel still deprived from land, from cities, infrastructure, from a better education, from access to government, and all of those things, from access to money resources, budget resources. And their behavior this time was as this deprived group who doesn't want to be in poverty anymore and it wants to be more influential. So, kind of an historical comparison, if you may.
Yeah, and just to quickly add one more point onto that, because it follows. Historically, the joint list parties particularly Balad, have been very extremist parties, saying and doing all sorts of things that rightfully outrage Israeli Jews, and that was logical in the context of Arab-Israeli politics, when those parties were essentially just vehicles for protest votes, right? They were not going to have any power. They weren't going to have any role. That made sense. As Arab voters turn out in bigger numbers, and as these parties grow, and as the demands from the Arab sector become far more focused on their place inside of Israel, I think that these parties are going to end up shifting positions, and we may actually end up down the road seeing an entirely new party representing Israeli Arabs that is actually focused on changing things inside of Israel the same way that any other party that operates in the Knesset operates. So I think that we're headed toward that as well. Not only greater Israeli Arab vote participation in politics, but I think a more moderate type of Arab leadership and participation.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I mean we've seen the role really emerge. I think a lot of it has to do with Ayman Odeh being prepared to take the joint list to recommend Gantz in the last round, and also this is to Bibi, who made a lot of his campaign with billboards around Israel with a picture of Gantz and TB, showing that is Gantz's only way to a government. I mean, it also attracted a lot of racist attacks against them, but at the same time, it shows that their role in the political process is growing, and I think that's definitely a positive thing. But I want to transition now to where I want to start with Netanyahu, to where he goes from here, because when he was at 60 seats in the exit polls, and when we thought that was happening, it looked likely that he may be able to convince one of the 60 MKs on the other side to defect and to go over. People were talking about Orly Levy because she has her own party, so it's kind of easier for her to move. People were talking about Omer Yankelevich in blue and white, who was caught on tape or was quoted on tape saying bad things about Benny Gantz, and the Likud threatened to release these tapes. But as soon as that right-wing bloc dropped to 58, it became a lot harder, and I'm going to say almost nothing's impossible, but almost impossible. So it seems that Netanyahu's only real way to maneuver here is to somehow to get the conversation back to a unity government, or I mean, what Tal said in the beginning, the unthinkable, a fourth election. How do you see this playing out?
Well, the problem is that getting the discourse back into unity government doesn't help at the moment, because there isn't any campaign. I mean, at least we don't think there is a campaign going on. So discussing something in the air, it's not good enough. Things needs to be done. He needs to move forward. Now, he was very, very stubborn last time, making a decision that he will not be second on the rotation government. When he was second, his party was second on the results. His party they had less votes back in September, and he was very resolute not to be second on the rotation. When he's first at the results, so obviously he has no plans to be second on the rotation. Blue and White actually says, if you want to do a rotation government, when we begin and you because of your legal troubles of the trial opening next 2 weeks, you may go second if you wish. No one in the Likud is even considering that. They just laugh at it. So one of the things that was put forward, it's not put forward yet, but one of the things that has been playing around in the last 48 hours, and I have to tell you that personally, I've contributed to that, is on Sunday, we had a press conference with Mr. Gantz. And I asked him, that was a day before the election. And I asked him, Mr. Gantz, will you consider putting forward a bill with your 62? I said to him, you may have 61 or you may have 62, but it's not a good group. It's not a group that is used to work together. But will you get this group together and put forward a bill that will say the prime minister under trial cannot form a government? It's not actually a prime minister. It's an MK, because right now Netanyahu is the outgoing prime minister. It doesn't have the Knesset. How do you say that? Vote of confidence. He's been without a vote of confidence for more than a year now. So no one has the vote of confidence. So 62 members can join together and put forward a bill that will change the rules and will say a prime minister at the beginning of a trial, as of the beginning of his trial, will not be entitled to be the one who form a government. Now, if something like that, of course, Gantz answered to me, I am willing to do everything politically and as long as it's okay under the law, to move Netanyahu from office. That was on Sunday before the election. Now, since yesterday, we are throwing out this video of Gantz answering me this question on all social networks, and it became a big discourse. Even today, the Likud faction meeting, the right-wing actually faction meeting, they kind of yelled out, this is impossible. This is against the wish of the people. It's a coup. It's unthinkable. It's against the law. You will see the Likudnik out in the streets and so on. It's not an option really yet, because Lieberman hasn't said that he's agreeing to do that. And without Lieberman playing along, I don't think it can work. Having said that, sometimes the left is only playing with those suggestions in order to stress the right wing. So we have to see. We don't know yet if this is a real solution or just like a discourse solution. Another option, as we said before, is finding detectors. Netanyahu can still do it. As we all know, Netanyahu is very sophisticated and very, he knows how to play behind the scene. The fact that we don't have any three names right now up front doesn't mean that the Likud is not already working on that. I would think that they are maybe doing something, but we don't really know the media. And well, the other option obviously is a fourth election.
Michael, what do you think the odds are? Well, not the odds. I mean, because it seems if Gantz wants to make any moves here, he will, not talking about unity, he will need to get Avigdor Lieberman and Yisrael Beitenu to cooperate with Ayman Odeh and parts of the joint list. Do you think there's any chance of that happening. And while you answer this, I'm just going to pull up our 120 project resource so people can actually just see and be refreshed visually with the actual election results.
There's always a chance, you're never going to say never, but obviously Lieberman and the Joint List don't get along, to put things mildly. I think that one of the motivating factors behind the even higher Arab-Israeli turnout this time over last time was the component of the Trump peace plan that would have unilaterally put the triangle, which is where many Arab Israelis live, into a state of Palestine and taken away their citizenship. And of course, that is a plan that is famously associated with Avigdor Lieberman. So, there are ways in which it can happen. Probably something along the lines of the Joint List voting for the government once, and then either voting against or abstaining on every policy that they put forth in the Knesset. But it's really hard to see. And that option was out there last time too, right? The numbers were there after election number 2 for a minority government to be formed with outside Joint List support, and it did not happen. And frankly, if I'm in Odeh and the Joint List, and I'm looking at the fact that in the first election, running separately, the two different blocks of Joint List parties were at 10 seats. And then in the second election, they were at 13 seats. And now they're at 15 seats. Their power is only increasing. And there doesn't seem to be much reason for them electorally to give the election to, or allow the formation of a government that includes Lieberman, when if they go to a fourth election, you have to assume that they'll do as well as this time, if not better, particularly since nobody ever talks about including them in a government anyway. So while lots of people have incentives to not go to a fourth election, I'm not sure the Joint List is one of the parties that has that incentive.
So before we go to questions, I see some great questions coming in. Just a reminder to ask a question, just use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or your mobile device. I want to take this conversation to the Trump plan, and Netanyahu made all these promises about implementing the annexation part of the Trump plan immediately after the election, promises that he's made before. Do we think, obviously a big difference between Netanyahu in an election campaign and Netanyahu the day after. Do we think this is all going to be on hold with all the things going on, from coronavirus to trying to actually form a government? Where does the Trump plan and this go from here? Tal, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, the current government has been in a very strained, very tense relationship with the Attorney General. The Attorney General has tried to stop some of those things to proceed back in August and September before the second election. You better ask yourself, can Netanyahu conduct any policy step, on Sunday without the attorney, when the Attorney General says, please do not do it. People here go to the High Court on every little step and try to block Netanyahu from doing things that he is not permitted to do. But we've seen recently, just a week before the election, this government specifically took steps that were against the advice of the Attorney General, and they just didn't care. The amount of cases where the government is doing things against the advice of the Attorney General is just growing. And I really don't know. Right now, it feels to me as if the only person who can stop Netanyahu from doing things is Trump. For example, Netanyahu wanted to proceed with the annexations or the sovereignty implementation, as they call it, with the backing of the US ambassador to Israel, Mr. David Friedman. But the White House was actually the component who came up and say, please don't do it when you have an interim prime minister. We're expecting a new government after the election. You can do it only after you have a government. So, but you know, how can you trust Trump to put the brakes on things like that next month? You know, if you're asking me personally, judging from what I've seen him from here, I don't think so. So if Trump will not stop him and Kushner will not stop him, and the Attorney General, you know, will try to stop him, but how strong can he be? He's being under this kind of, you know, a lot of pressure, and we do have the trial coming up. So we probably might see some steps. I can't really tell you. It's hard to predict.
Definitely isn't easy to predict. Michael, quick thoughts before we go to questions?
I think that acting upon the territorial components in the Trump plan is probably going to be Netanyahu's, the key to Netanyahu trying to get people to flip over to get to 61. You know, when everybody thought he was at 60, Orly Levy was a very obvious one person to flip, but now he's got to flip 3. And people are focused in particular on Yoaz Hendel and Zvi Hauser in Kachol Lavan, and they issued a statement yesterday saying that nobody has approached them and nobody will approach them because everybody knows that they're not going to flip. But ultimately, these are 2 guys who very much support West Bank annexation. And if I were Kachol Lavan, I'd be pretty concerned that Bibi goes to them and says, "Listen, the Trump plan it's sitting out there. This is our chance to do it. You know, if you really care about the West Bank, come over." Now, maybe that will be successful. Maybe it won't. I think that Hendel and Hauser, again, they could have flipped, you know, after the first election, after the second election, and both of them really don't like Netanyahu. So it's a long shot. But my guess is that that's the strategy that he will use, or the tactic he will use to try to get them. Again, I don't know that it'll work, but I think that's probably what he's going to try to pick on. And it's not just going to be in private. He's going to talk about it in public incessantly, about how, you know, this is the last opportunity to implement this, and it's about to go away. And anybody who cares about Yehuda v'Shomron, it's your duty to come and help us see it through.
If I may add, if that's okay, to my opinion, those 2 gentlemen will be the last one to flip. They know Netanyahu so well, and they have been burned by him, you know, badly. So I don't see that happening anytime soon. I have to also, there is a big group of right-wing people in Boogie Ya'alon party that are more against Netanyahu than any of the lefties. So there is like this group of maybe you can compare it to the Never Trumpers, right? It's like the Never Netanyahu's people who will not do anything with him, no matter what. They rather sit at home and be confined than working with him. As per Orly Levy, if I may add, she came out today with a statement. You know, part of the things that the Likud said, they said that they will offer her father, the respectable David Levy, who was Israel foreign affairs minister many years ago. They are trying to offer him to become Israel president. She came out in a statement and said, this is ridiculous. If anyone thinks that they can buy the Levi family, if anytime they think that we have a price tag and they can just buy us off. She was very clear about this, you know, suggestion and rumors that have been flying off. So, I mean, she has a big temptation because they are offering her to become health minister. But right now it seems unlikely with respect to her. I would go, if I were Netanyahu, he would probably go for back, you know, how do you say, like backbenches people that are not
the
really
lower ranked MPs in Kachol Lavan,
yeah,
like
people
the 25,
that
26, 27.
Right. Hauser and Hendel are very, you know, big public personas. They're very well known. They have a lot to lose. Whereas if you have those backbenches in all of those parties, people that are, you know, they're not famous. This is like a once in a lifetime opportunity to gain something. this is a more probable situation, but we'll see. We'll have to see.
The Gadi Yavarkans of the.
Well, he already moved.
That style. He already moved, but that kind. The Gadi Yavarkan was a MK from Tel Em who moved over to the Likud.
Also, don't be surprised if Netanyahu is approaching the Joint Arab List and telling them, maybe you can avoid a vote. You don't have to vote against me. Just do not vote against me. You don't have to vote for me, but you can vote, you can abstain, and I will give you big chunks of budgets and so on. I won't be surprised if this will happen.
Which, by the way, happened after the first election, where
exactly.
He sent Netanyahu.
So let's move over to questions. We have a question from a board member of ours, Bob Sugarman, who asks, what are the chances that President Rivlin is able to convince Netanyahu and Gantz to form a unity government? Now, last round, everybody was talking about the Rivlin proposal as like the most likely proposal to be accepted, but Gantz had to him, he had no reason, he said, to trust Netanyahu, that he would fulfill. Maybe, Michael, could you remind what that proposal was, and maybe Tal, just do you think this is possible? I mean, he's tried once, we'll try again. Is there any greater likelihood that it will work?
Yeah, the proposal last time was this idea that Bibi would start as prime minister, and then when he was if and when he was indicted, he wouldn't step down as prime minister, but he would sort of he would kind of be a disabled prime minister, and Gantz would fill in as acting prime minister to allow Bibi to fight his court case, and then Bibi could come back. Gantz wasn't willing to accept that last time. And this time, unlike last time, Bibi's actually been indicted. So I'm not even sure how that arrangement would now work. It would mean Bibi agreeing to become prime minister, but immediately after becoming prime minister, step down temporarily in order to fight his cases. And there's simply no way that I don't see any way in which he agrees to do that. And he, wouldn't agree to go second last time. I think Tal already mentioned he's not going to agree to go second this time when he has a 4-seat advantage. So I don't think that proposal is still possible if it ever was, and it's difficult for me to see how a unity government happens.
So my opinion is that the president has his own heritage, or his own how do you say that? People at his stance, at his position, are always saying history will judge me, and
he has his own interests.
I'm sorry?
He has his own interests.
I couldn't hear you very well, but I will have to say that Rivlin he's 80 years old. He's looking after whatever is left behind him when he's stepping down from his presidency next year at mid 2021. He needs to think about his heritage. And he's been heavily burned personally from the last round. He came up with a solution he thought was reasonable, but the solution was twisted by some of the sides, and it was also kind of manipulated and twisted by the media a bit. And the backlash for him was huge. There was, at the end of the process, the criticism against Rivlin was piling on. And from what I'm sensing for talking to the president's people, I'm sensing that this time around is really unwilling to step into the foray. He's just, he doesn't want to take part in this game. He had a severe saying the other day. He said on Monday, when he went to the polling station and put his own ballot and was talking to the Israeli people while doing it, he said, I feel ashamed and I feel disengaged and I'm really disappointed. This shouldn't be the way a democracy conducts itself. So listening to him, you can really understand that he was heavily wounded by the process that took place last time. And I have a feeling that he will try to play his formal role without anything further than that this time around, which means that, you know, the problem remains.
Yeah, definitely. So we have an interesting question here from Eli Khan Postel, which is about the electoral system. And in the nightmare scenario, I'm going to call it a nightmare, that we go to fourth election, what are the chances that the electoral system is changed? Maybe we have a direct election for prime minister, like there was in the past, or is that an option? I think Tal answered with a head shake. What do you guys think?
It's impossible, because for any constitutional change, you need 61. They can only do minor constitutional changes, not a whole reform. In order to fix the election bills, the election laws in such a definite way, you definitely need you know, a huge public discourse and a public support. It's not going to happen. Plus, people always say you don't change the rules through the game. I don't know. It feels as if it's not going to happen until something happens. Maybe when my youngest is 11, we maybe will be reaching the time when my son is going to have voting rights when he is 18. We're just going to keep on going up until my son reaches 18.
Yeah, I think even if the votes were there, I don't know that the High Court would allow it anyway under a transitional government to change the voting system. So I'd say zero chance.
Yeah. Okay, moving on with a question here, interesting question from Jess Sadik, which is, so the news analysis says that the Israeli Arab voter turnout was high due only to opposition to the Trump plan and the potential of the transfer of the triangle residents. And if that is the main reason for the higher voter Arab turnout, and it's not kind of less a change in Arab Israeli society, are we overstating the significance?
I don't think so. I mean, between election 1 and election 2, Arab turnout went up over 10%. Between election 2 and election 3, it looks like it's up another, nearly 10%. I think that if I'm an Arab voter and I've seen it go from 10 joint lists to 13 joint lists to 15 joint list seats in under a year, I'm not staying home next time. I'm just going to be energized to come out and vote more. It's not as if the factors that are turning them out are going to disappear if there's a fourth election. I think that higher turnout in the next election cycle, if it is indeed 3 or 4 months from now, I think this is here to stay.
Let me add, I think the Arab are they're short of 16 seats. So they're very, very close to the 16 seats, which means the voter turnout is even higher than we think. So actually in the last 24 hours, when the numbers were, back and forth, there was a couple of hours when they had already 16 seats. So they're very close to it. To my opinion, one of the reasons the voter turnout went high is because Ayman Odeh and Ahmed Tibi, the chairman of this party, recommended Gantz back in September. So one of the things that you hear when you go to Arab villages is they keep telling you, we want to have influence. We want to be part of the game. When the Arab politicians are disengaged and when the Arab politicians are saying, we are not recommending either sides, then the public is disappointed. But when the Arab politicians are playing the game as like anybody else, when they start to play it with the right wing, they can play with Netanyahu, right? We said it before. They helped Netanyahu in the dissolvement of the 21st Knesset. Or when they play it with the left wing, then the Arab population is more content. It doesn't mean that they're going to be part of the government, but if they will be able to put forward bills that will satisfy the Arab public, for example, one of those really important bills is about the way houses are built. It's in the housing business. It's about how houses are being built in Arab villages. The current government of Netanyahu managed to change the bills and increase the way you are ruining or the way that you are demolishing some of the Arab houses, some of the Arab villages. Now, their biggest demand right now is to change that bill. Now, Netanyahu, because he wanted to convince them that he's not a threat anymore, already promised to change that bill. So this is a big thing. If this bill will be canceled with the work of Ayman Odeh and Ahmed Tibi, you will definitely see the Arab people saying, okay, we are now have more influence because we are 15, because we are almost 16, we're able to get this specific bill with respect to demolishing changed. That's huge. That's really important to them. Actually, if you talk to the Arab population in Israel and you think they are busy with the Palestinian people, you'll be surprised. All they care about is education, budgets, infrastructure, housing, crime, and the law enforcement behavior in the Arab villages. And then only when you go down the list, you reach the Palestinian people that are beyond the 57 lines. So it's not on the top of the list for them to think about the Palestinian issue. They think about consumer rights, banking, those things.
So we also have a question about the Likud leadership and how do the results change the question of if this makes an alternative for Bibi to emerge. We know Gideon Sa'ar challenged him with a pretty poor showing in a Likud primary earlier this year, was at the end of last. But what does the Netanyahu succession picture look right now? I think Netanyahu looks in pretty solid control of the Likud party. What are your thoughts?
I think the right wing is very energized these days. They had a huge celebration on Monday night. They were very happy to see that the prime minister went from 32 seats to 36. That's he said it today. He brought home the largest number in Israel's history. If you look at the numbers, but also 36. I mean, this is going back to the days of two big parties when you have lots of people. The base is very energized. If you start to talk to them about any of these suggestions where the bill will be changed to not allowing a prime minister under indictment to become the next prime minister, they will tell you that they're going to take to the streets and they have great disbelief in the country's attorney general. When you were listening to the rally on a Monday night, the victory because it wasn't really a victory, but they called it a victory rally, when some people in the crowds have shouted, fire Mendelblit, fire Mendelblit. So that means, fire the attorney general, like the Jeff Sessions firing. They wanted Netanyahu to fire him, even though it's not as easy as they may think. So the base is highly energized. They are willing to go into demonstrations against the High Court, against the Attorney General, against the state attorneys. Kind of the deep state situation is taking control over there.
Yeah, I think Netanyahu's hold on the right is pretty absolute at this point, and nobody's emerging to challenge him. He's going to stay there until he is convicted and the conviction is upheld by the Supreme Court, or until he steps down voluntarily. But I don't think that anybody, especially after Gideon Sa'ar's failed bid, where he only didn't even get 25% of the vote in the Likud leadership, and this is Gideon Sa'ar, who for years was the most popular MK within Likud after Netanyahu. nobody's going to look at that and say, yeah, now's the time to try and challenge Bibi. So he's there until he wants to go.
So I think we'll conclude with two questions that are Netanyahu related. One's from Gary Gilbert, which if Netanyahu returns as PM, what happens to him during the upcoming trial? What would happen if he is convicted? Now, currently, I mean, I'm not going to answer this completely, but a prime minister legally in Israel cannot be convicted. That is when it would end, but it would only end after a Supreme Court appeal that would be upheld. So that's one. And the other question is, where did this Likud surge come from? Did it come from Likudniks that stayed at home during the last election that Netanyahu was talking about? Did it come from Kahlon / Gesher voters in the past, what are coined like soft right voters in Israel that voted for blue and white in the last round and then moved over to Likud this round? Where did that surge come from? So let's those two questions, and then we'll wrap up.
So I guess on the second question, remember they're only up 20,000 votes this time over last time. So yes, there was a surge, but it's more.
Wait, the Likud?
Yeah, Likud.
200,000 votes more.
I'm sorry, 200,000 votes more. So yes, there's a surge, but a lot of it is also reorganizing because Yamina lost ground again, even over last time.
And Otzma Yehudit, even
right.
The Kahanist party, which had about 80,000 votes, the equivalent of two and a half seats last time, dropped to 15,000 votes around this time. So that's
exactly.
Also yeah.
Exactly. So I think a lot of it, at least half, seems to be reshifting among that block, and some of it certainly seems to be voters who stayed home last time and have been re-energized. That might be because Netanyahu is actually under indictment, and so they feel compelled to come out and defend him. It might be the fact that this time his tactic in the last week was to talk about how they were, at 59.3 seats and they're so close to getting over the line and people have to come out. So I think it's a combination of these things, but it also it goes back to that last question, which is that Netanyahu's got to hold over his voters, and they come out to support him when he calls them.
I agree. I think people from Kahlon party, Netanyahu kept saying 300,000 people stayed at home, but that wasn't really true. We fact-checked that in our paper, and the people that he said that were stayed at home and did not go to vote actually voted other parties. I think he has one seat from Yamina, from Bennett, because Bennett is down from 8. He has from 8 to 7. He has one seat from Lieberman, because Lieberman is down from 8 to 7 as well. Probably another seat from the Kahlon Orly Levy crowds, and kind of a shift inside, inside the bloc. With respect to for the other question about the conviction, it's true. Under Israel law, he can only be taken off position if he is convicted after an appeal, which means probably 4 to 5 years from now, or maybe 3 to 4 years. I can't really tell, but it's a long way to go, because obviously complicated cases, lots of witnesses. The prime minister will not waive in. He will demand, postponement or other. He will use all of the efforts to hold off the trial, so it can take years. And we're not approaching an easy time. I think putting a prime minister on trial while he is incompetent gonna tear the Israeli society pretty hard. I expect some demonstrations, some people on the streets from the right wing. We've already seen that. Last time he called the Attorney General, he called him a person who conducted a coup against him. We saw big demonstrations with a lot of angry people on the streets, and I do expect that this will return because as you can see, is very popular. So
I don't mean to interrupt, but now in Israel, you can't have a protest with more than 5,000 people in the same place because of coronavirus.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true.
I don't know if the right wingers will listen, the Netanyahu supporters will listen to that.
We're not going to be under this confinement for a long time. So, but I even if it's not even if it's not demonstration on the streets, you do have a sentiment in the social media. And obviously the media, the Israeli mainstream media also has a big support in the Israel mainstream media. And you will see, I think, the Israeli society being torn apart over this in a devastating way. I mean, I'm expecting some tough years with that.
Yeah. So if there's no final thoughts, any final thoughts from you guys before we close out?
I wish I could end on a more positive note, right?
Okay. So fourth elections in a few months, or
I was going to say that the positive note is more democracy for Israeli voters, I think, coming up.
Well, we have voter turnout coming up at every cycle, so I guess in the fourth election maybe we'll see 75% voter turnout. Who knows? Israeli.
No. Definitely, and it's really high because even in that number that includes Israelis that I think don't even live in Israel who have a Teudat Zehut. So it's a very, very high number. But with that, I want to thank Tal Schneider so much for joining us, and Michael Koplow. Thank you guys so much for your insights. You can. For those of you who want to check out our resources and sign up to receive our communications, as our Executive Director David Halperin mentioned earlier, just go to our website, israelpolicyforum.org. With that, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining. Hopefully, we won't be in the midst of a fourth election cycle, but we will have lots more of these sort of calls if we do. And everybody have a great rest of the week. Thanks.